All right, so today's session is going to be one of three similar sessions in which we look at examples of sociological thinking. We've got lots of different examples out there. I'm going to focus on three, beginning with Emile Durkheim, French sociologist, and what he had to say about the organization of society and how it operated. And then we will proceed on to a couple of other examples. Understand that a focus on Durkheim or a focus on Marx or a focus on Weber isn't quite random, but it is, again, sort of not necessarily encompassing, right? That every sociologist, by definition, is engaging in sociological thinking. So we could do this just as easily by looking at any other number of different social theorists. Part of the reason that sociology has focused on people like Durkheim and Marx and Weber is that they are really, really influential in the early years of the discipline. Sociology as a discipline emerges in the late 1800s in response to the work of a number of people, but especially noteworthy among those people are people like Durkheim and Marx and Weber. So we're going to focus on them just because, again, they're kind of nice exemplars of people using a sociological imagination, even though the term itself doesn't come along until the mid-1900s in the United States. So Emile Durkheim is a French sociologist, born in 1858, dies in 1917. He is arguably most responsible, I think most responsible for the establishment of sociology as a scientific, evidence-driven endeavor. He engages in a kind of scientific approach called positivism, which I don't really think you need to know too much about. But it's this idea that there's a systematic series of truths about society that are out there to be uncovered using the application of rigorous scientific methodologies, and specifically things like statistical methodologies. We're not really going to spend too much time on that. What I'm going to do instead is talk about the way in which Durkheim kind of legitimizes a scientific approach to studying society. Also, how he sort of lays out a framework in which his underlying assumptions lead him to generate particular theories which lead to things like observation, measurement, and testing, so that the incorporation of that scientific method. And also how he kind of salvages the reputation of sociology. He turns it into a serious endeavor, and it very much was not a serious endeavor in the 1800s, and I'll get into a little bit of the backstory there. So Durkheim was influenced by the ideas of an earlier French social theorist, not really a sociologist, although he did coin the term sociology, but this guy named Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte, born in 1798, dies in 1857, a year before Durkheim is born. Comte, right, grew up in the wake of the French Revolution and some of the really horrible features of French society at that time, right? It was a very chaotic and bloody, sort of tumultuous period of time. And it also coincided with this kind of sort of surge in Enlightenment philosophy, and people sort of embracing the ideas of the Enlightenment and sort of trying to chart out better, more inclusive, more socially just societies. The American Revolution had happened in the late 1700s, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. There were certainly the Industrial Revolution was beginning to sort of unfold, which itself was the merging of a lot of technology and science with some Enlightenment philosophy, and a decay or an erosion in the power of the monarchies and the sort of traditional systems of power and authority that had characterized Europe for a really long time. So Comte is in this kind of transitional moment in society, and he offers up a set of ideas about what holds society together and about the dynamic that exists within societies in a way that really challenged a lot of orthodox thought at the time. A lot of what people thought explained the nature of the world was being sort of shown to be sort of inaccurate. And without going into a lot of detail, Comte's arguments essentially revolved around the idea that there were these things in the world called social forces. Some social forces contributed to stability. Now, he called those things social statics. Other things contributed to social change. He called those things social dynamics, right? So things that would promote stability in society and other things that would promote change and shifts in society. Comte was, and he's not wrong. Right? Obviously, that's not particularly controversial here in the early years of the 21st century. But one of the things that Comte argued was that we needed to understand the nature of society as a thing that exerts influence over people. And that was kind of radical at the time, because at the time people used the word society to sort of just describe all the people who lived in a place, right? So French society consisted of all the people who lived in France. British society consisted of all the people who lived in Britain, etc., etc. The idea that society was this force that had some degree of influence or control over our lives, that was kind of unheard of, right? That was sort of considered to be a very unorthodox sort of idea. Comte sort of runs with this. He says, this is a thing. It's a thing that we should understand, and we should use our understanding of it to lead better lives and have, as a result of that, better societies. And what he proposed, and so far so good, right? But I mean, what he proposed turns out to be a little bit of where things go off the track. Comte's idea was that we would have these places in society, these buildings, these actual physical structures, where people would go and they would listen to what the sociologists had to say about how they should live their lives. And then they would go live their lives that way, and society would be a better place. He essentially was arguing that we should replace a theistic religion with a secular sort of religion, a religion of humanity. And that's where he lost most people. Most people are like, you know what? We're already kind of tired of the authority of the church. We don't want to swap that out for the authority of some sort of secular iteration of the church. We're good. And Comte's notion of a kind of humanistic sociology kind of fades into the background. Years later, Durkheim comes along. He's clearly familiar with the ideas of Comte. He thinks there's some value there. But he isn't interested in replacing a theistic religion with a secular religion. He's interested in taking those ideas about sociology and turning them into a science, a rigorous, empirically grounded, evidence-based understanding of the world around us. And to get people to come on board with this, to get people to be persuaded, he kind of has to show them. He has to give them evidence. It isn't enough to just sort of make a philosophical or persuasive argument that, here's how society should respond to its internal conditions in a way that sort of offsets the worst effects of them, or elevates and institutionalizes the best aspects of it. He wants to demonstrate things to people with evidence and let them come to those conclusions themselves. He makes an argument that societies are ordered. They show a kind of organization and a cohesion that is a reflection of a deep-seated need for order, right? Order is the only way that society is going to hold itself together. Can't have chaos, can't have unpredictability. So what we need is something to hold everybody together. This is important because one of the underlying assumptions of not just Durkheim, but lots of people at the time, one of the underlying assumptions is that the nature of human beings is inherently selfish right? That we are self-interested, um, brutal little creatures. The philosopher Hobbes sort of writes in the preceding century, writes that in nature, humankind would exist in a war of all against all, right? A very kind of brutal and dark and cynical view of humanity, right? But that we are just essentially um, selfish and driven by self-interest. And yet, Durkheim was looking around Paris of the late 1700s, or of the late 1800s. Sorry, get my centuries mixed up. Durkheim's looking around Paris of the late 1800s, and he sees people cooperating. He sees people engaging in reciprocal behaviors. He sees them, even being altruistic or generous to other people. He's like, where's that selfishness, right? Where did that go? What's happening here? Clearly, society is doing something to us to turn us from creatures who are inherently selfish and self-interested into creatures who are social, right? He starts with a focus on what he calls solidarity. He's really interested in where this comes from and what is its nature. Solidarity is just a sense of community. It's a sense of togetherness, right? It's the connection that we feel to other people. And he says, he being Durkheim, says there are two kinds of solidarity, right? In pre-industrial society, right? So before the Industrial Revolution, back in the 1600s and the 1500s and the 1400s, the thing that held society together back then was something he called mechanical solidarity. And this was solidarity that was based on likeness, similarity, right? So you get up in the morning, you walk out onto the streets of your little town or your little village, because back then people lived mostly in small villages and small towns, right? Big cities existed, but they weren't where most people lived. And they weren't all that big either, right? So when we think of big cities today, you think of Tokyo with tens of millions of people. That thing did not exist. That's a really, really modern phenomenon. So most people live in these small towns and these small villages. And when you walk out onto the street, you see people who have lived in the same village for as long as your family has lived in that village, maybe hundreds of years. You wear the same kind of clothes. You speak the same language with the same accent. You eat the same foods. You worship at the same church. It's like you're looking into a mirror, right? Every day when you get up and you walk outside, it's just a bunch of people who are kind of just like you. And because you are highly similar to them, because you share so much in common with them, you feel a sense of connection, a sense of togetherness with them. That's mechanical solidarity. The Industrial Revolution comes along beginning in the late 1600s and really accelerating in the 1700s. And one of the things that happens is a period of rapid urbanization, right? People moving from villages and towns into the cities. And in the cities, the people you see are more likely to be strangers, right? Maybe they all speak French, but each person has a slightly different accent because some of them are from Paris, some of them are from the south of France, some of them are from Normandy, some of them are from the Alsace-Lorraine region on the eastern border of France, right? So they're from all over the place. Different foods, different religions, different tastes and preferences, different clothing, right? So different shared history, right? No sense of shared common experiences to hold people together. His argument is that what's holding these people together, because they also have solidarity, is what he calls organic solidarity. This is solidarity that's based on interdependency. Now we hear the word organic and we think of fields and nature and small towns and all of that. Here's where Durkheim's using the word a little bit differently than we might use it in everyday conversation in 2022. Durkheim's argument is that society is made up of specialized interdependent parts, much like the organs in a body, which is where he gets the word organic. It's an organic system, a system of organs. Everybody doing their part creates a system of interdependency in which we can be different from one another, but still work together as a whole, right? And that's the solidarity that he sees in existence in France in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. He says, the population's pretty heterogeneous. We're different from each other, and yet we feel connected to each other, and it's not because we have commonalities. It's because we're all kind of playing our part in this very elaborate division of labor, and every society, every specialized large-scale organization and structure has taken the interrelated tasks that are necessary to accomplish its goals and broken it up into small parts. It's like, Harper College is the same sort of idea. You go to Harper College to get a broad education. One of the things you might learn about is sociology, but you might also learn about humanities, and you might learn about chemistry. I could probably teach you a little bit about humanities, but not as much as, say, Professor Kaplow. I could maybe teach you a little bit of chemistry, but not nearly as much as Professor Kidwell or Dowd or Wachter, right? So, you go to the specialist. You go to the sociologist to learn about sociology. You go to the psychologist to learn about psychology. You go to the chemist to learn about chemistry, et cetera, et cetera. So we've taken the task of sharing a really broad set of specialized skills and specialized knowledge with a generation of people who don't yet have those skills or that knowledge. And we've assigned very specific parts of that process to people within the structure, right? And that's a division of labor. So think of that on a more broad sort of social scale, and you kind of get a sense of what it is that Durkheim's arguing about. So the outcome of this structure, the outcome of this set of structures, I should say, are positive, socially beneficial outcomes, what Durkheim will call functions. Right? So the purpose of society is to create beneficial outcomes. And beneficial outcomes, the product of social structures, can be one of two things. They can be manifest, right? Those are intended, or they can be latent, right? Those can be unintended, but they are nevertheless benefits, right? So an intended function is, or a manifest function, is one that is beneficial and was part of the plan. A latent function is something that's beneficial but is just kind of a side effect. So there are two manifest functions, just to go back to Harper College for a moment, there are two manifest functions of Harper College. One is to provide students with education. The second is to credential that experience. So you take classes and you earn a degree. That's it. That's what the college exists to do. Is that all the college does? No, of course not. For example, one of the things that you learn to do when you're in college is work with an increasingly diverse population of social others, right? Your elementary schools are more homogenous than your junior high schools. Your junior high schools are a little bit more heterogeneous than your elementary schools, but not as much as your high schools are going to be. And then when you transition from high school to colleges or universities, which are drawing from people from an even wider sort of geographic territory, you're going to end up with even more diversity. And learning how to deal with diversity is really, really important in a society as diverse as the United States. So do you learn how to deal with diversity at Harper College? Yes, you do. And is that a good thing? Absolutely it is. Is that why we organized Harper College? No, it's not. We organized Harper College to provide people with education and credentials. The fact that we also do this other thing that's generally and socially good is just kind of like nice. Harper College may be the place where some people have their first adult relationships. We don't put that in the recruiting material. Come to Harper College. We've got the hottest co-eds, right? That would be pretty creepy. That'd be pretty cringe. So what we do instead, of course, is we understand that this is something that happens at college. We're all happy that people learn how to have adult relationships, both friendships and romantic relationships. But again, it's not why we have universities or colleges. So that's the distinction, that functions are things that are socially beneficial. Some functions are intended, others are just kind of happy circumstances or coincidences. What we want to avoid are dysfunctions. Dysfunctions are outcomes of social action that have negative impacts on a society's well-being. One of the biggest dysfunctions in a society is people reverting back to their own self-interest, right? If you're going to operate in the interest of you as an individual, as opposed to the well-being and stability of society as a structure, that's going to be bad for society. It might work out for you, maybe, right? But it's definitely not going to help society. And so institutions and structures exist to minimize dysfunction, to increase function and minimize dysfunction. And this is this is what Durkheim is kind of focusing on. This is what really kind of drives his model of how society is organized and how it works. And he says that social structures do this through two sort of forces, two exterior forces. The first is what he calls integration. Integration is a sense of membership. It's a sense of belonging, right? We're part of something bigger than ourselves. Regulation is a sense of what the normative standards are. How am I supposed to conduct myself? How am I supposed to behave? What are the rules, right? So social structures like families and school and religion and governance and all these other social institutions, they exist to instill in each of us a sense of integration and a sense of regulation. And when those structures do those things, when they give us integration and regulation in appropriate amounts, then we get functional behavior, right? People in society do the things that benefit society as a whole, which has the add-on effect, of course, of benefiting them as individuals, because when society does well, the people in the society do well. When institutions don't provide appropriate levels of integration and regulation, then dysfunction becomes much more likely as an outcome. And that's the thing that he's concerned about. That's the thing he's sort of arguing, that society exists to turn us into social beings so that we can do what society expects of us, and society itself is a place of order and function, right? And in fact, the theoretical paradigm that's going to grow out of the work of Emile Durkheim is what we call structural functionalism. The idea that structures exist in the form that they exist because they are functional that way. That's the whole purpose of their being. Now, all of this up to this point is theoretical, right? This is just Durkheim speculating about the nature of the social world. But as I mentioned, he wants sociology to be a science. He thinks that there is a way to demonstrate to people the validity of his claim. And so he's going to go out and test this, right? It's not enough for him to have arrived at an explanation for things that makes sense to him. He feels as though there's a way to show other people that, hey, there's this thing out there called society. It has an impact on our lives. And when it does things right, things generally work out well for people. And when it doesn't do things right, problems arise, right? This is his attempt to kind of apply a sociological imagination. So he needs to take his theory and he needs to turn it into something that can be measured, something that can be tested. He needs to generate a hypothesis out of this theory. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about scientific methodologies a bit later in the semester, but a little bit of a spoiler. A theory is what we call a conceptual statement, which means that it contains concepts. Concepts are the things that are of interest to a scientist. So for Durkheim, the concepts at work here are things like integration and regulation and social dysfunction. The problem is that you can't directly measure integration, regulation, or social dysfunction. He needs to come up with measures that capture those concepts. He needs what are called indicators. The process of taking a concept and making it operational, in other words, turning it into an indicator, which you can then go measure or test for, is called operationalization. So he has to operationalize his theory so that he can then test it. So he needs something that represents integration. And he settles on marital status, right? Okay, I can measure whether a person is married or not. The idea is that if somebody's married, definitionally, they are part of something larger than themselves. Ergo, they might feel a greater sense of integration than somebody who is single. He needs a measure for regulation. For regulation, he chooses educational attainment. The idea being that the more education a person has, the less likely they are to just follow the rules, right? That when you tell somebody who is really smart, who has a lot of education, a lot of experience studying something, when you say, go do this, their first inclination is not to say, okay, yes, it's to say why, right? Why don't we do it this other way, right? There are people who are educated tend to be more skeptical. They tend to be more critical thinkers. they tend to be resistant to just following the rules, right? And so Durkheim's argument was that the more education a person has, the less regulated they are. Right? Again, you can measure it. It's presumably a pretty good stand-in for regulation. He comes up with a third measure, one that he thinks captures both regulation and integration, and that's religious practice. Now, I want to be really clear. When he talks about religious practice, he's not talking about belief. He's talking about the nature of worship service. And the two main groups in France at the time were Catholics and Protestants. There was a Jewish population and there were some Muslims as well, but generally speaking, the two major religious groups in France in the late 1800s are Catholics and Protestants. And so what he does is he says, all right, so I'm going to go and measure a person's religious belief, not religious beliefs, religious practices, with the idea that Catholics are going to be higher on measures of integration and regulation, right? Again, because of the nature of the worship service. It's a little bit complicated, but the idea is that if you are Catholic and it's the late 1800s and you're in France, you are in need of an intermediary. You need the priest, a figure of authority, to tell you how you should conduct yourself with regard to religion and what religion has to say about how you should lead your life. And the reason for that is that the French Bible for Catholics is written in Latin, and the Mass is said in Latin. And most French Catholics don't read Latin. They don't understand the words that are in the pages of the Bible, even if they had a copy of the Bible. So if you want to know what God intends for you to do with your life, you go to the priest, and you trust that the priest is going to tell you the truth, that the priest is going to be a reliable authority on how one should lead their life. It's also the case that the religious practice, the worship service that Catholics engage in is more integrative, right? It's the word is Mass, right? They go to Mass. And the idea here is that the worship service is very communal, right? It's integrated in a way that the Protestant tradition is not, right? The Protestant Bible is written in French. So if you want to know what God wants you to do with your life, you read the Bible and you figure it out for yourself. French Protestant worship service is much more individual or small groups. It's not a large service. People have a more individualized relationship with God. There are no intermediaries, for example. If you commit a sin and you're Catholic, you confess your sin to the priest. If you're a Protestant, you confess your sin to God, right? There's no middle person there. So the idea is that Protestants would be less integrated and less regulated than Catholics. And again, that's kind of him taking the concepts and he turns them into operational indicators. The final measure is a measure for dysfunction. And the measure for dysfunction that he selects is suicide. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Suicide is seen as a highly individualized, highly personal decision. It is definitely antithetical to social order, right? You can't have a society in which the norm is to go kill yourself because that society is not going to last. So his argument is, or at least the implicit argument in his hypothesis is going to be that people who are Protestant, who are highly educated, and who are single are going to have a higher rate of suicide than Catholics who are married and who are less educated, right? Because in the first group, integration and regulation are going to be lower than in the second group. And then he goes out and he measures it, right? He goes all the way, all around France. He goes to the center of government in each of these territorial subdivisions, what we would think of as maybe states or counties. And France is a smaller country. They called them parishes, right? But it's basically just geopolitical subdivisions within the country of France. And he went to the center of government in each of those areas, and he collected all the death records, and he made a pile of all the suicides. And on the death records would be things like whether a person was Protestant or Catholic, whether they were married or single, whether they had attended school or had they not attended school, right? So he was able to glean all of that information and then run a statistical analysis. And what he found was that married Catholics with low levels of education had a lower rate of suicide than single Protestants with high levels of education. Right? That's what the data show, right? And yet, even when you break it out, when you just when you compare married people to single people had a higher rate of suicide than married people. When you compared Protestants to Catholics, Protestants had a higher rate of suicide than Catholics. When you looked at highly educated people versus uneducated people, people with higher levels of education had a higher rate of suicide than people who had less education. And he publishes all of this in a book published in 1897 called Suicide. Very creative title. Sociologists, for the record, sociologists suck when it comes to book titles. We're terrible at it, right? All of our book titles are just, everything's right there on that cover page. So he writes this book, Suicide, gets it published. It's been in print ever since. Right? I don't think it's ever been out of print. It's an incredibly well done piece of positivist sociological research. And here's the thing. If social connections had no impact at all on suicide, then the suicide rate for married people and single people would be the same. If society did not exert an influence over people, then highly educated people and uneducated people would have the same rate of suicide. Protestants and Catholics would have the same rate of suicide. But they don't. Right? So there's the number. There's the inconvenient fact. The inconvenient fact for people who want to argue that society does not have any influence over what a person does needs to explain then why married people and single people have different rates of suicide, right? Because it's clearly not the individual organism, right? That's a phenomena of social relations. That's a social fact. Now, it doesn't mean that if you're a highly educated single Protestant, you might as well just go hang yourself in the barn tomorrow because it's just a matter of time. Nor does that mean that every single married, uneducated Catholic is completely safe against the threat of suicide. Right? He's not saying that married, uneducated Catholics never kill themselves. Nor is he saying that every single highly educated single Protestant will kill themselves. He's saying when you look at the rate of suicide in those two groups, one group has a higher rate than another. And the fact that it isn't a universal tendency in either Catholics or Protestants or single people and married people or highly educated people and uneducated people, the fact that it's a pattern that's true of the group, even as it's not necessarily true of each individual member of the group, is what makes it a social fact. And that's what he does. He sort of in the course of just a couple of publications like this, he completely changes the public perception of sociology and creates in the mind of the public the idea that, hey, you know what? Social connections matter. Social forces do indeed exert an influence over people's lives in a way that, you know, in the middle of the 1800s, nobody really assumed that. When we get into the 1900s, everybody's coming to accept it. So today, nothing particularly radical or unorthodox about what Durkheim discovered, but you have to contextualize it. You have to realize that when he did this work over 100 years ago, it was radical. It fundamentally transformed the way that people looked at society and the assumptions that they were making about the nature of society. And that's Durkheim. That's why this guy gets a lot of credit, even 120, 130 years later. He gets a tremendous amount of credit for the contribution he makes because he single-handedly sort of establishes sociology as a legitimate scientific and scholarly pursuit. He's not the earliest sociologist. He's certainly not the last, and I don't think he's even the best. But he is pivotal, and he's really, really important for that reason. So there are three things that get established with his study of suicide, sort of definitively, right? Things that just absolutely from that point forward can't really be disputed. The first is that individual behavior is affected by social factors, right? Social determinism is demonstrated empirically with evidence in 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 Durkheim's study. That's the most important conclusion that comes out of that. Second is that there's a thing that transcends individuals, right? There's this thing called society, and it's worth studying because it exerts an influence, right? If it exerts an influence, we need to understand its nature so that we can understand the nature of its influence. And then the third is that an evidence-based, right, scientific, empirical understanding of the social world is something that's possible, right? That this is a pursuit that is worth engaging in, and that is an example of really good sociological thinking. All right, so that'll wrap it up for Durkheim, and next time we'll talk a little bit about Karl Marx. All right, so until then, have a good one.